Hello everyone, I am the Desert Gardener, and today we're talking about plant nutrient deficiencies. So whenever a plant is not doing well, whether it's in the garden, in a container outside, or in a container in your house, there is a number of different possible reasons for that. Could be overwatering, underwatering, too much sun, not enough sun, wounding, pathogens, diseases, insects, or nutrient deficiencies. Now that's way too much to cover in one video, so I'm just going to talk about nutrient deficiencies in this video. And I'll be talking about the other ones later. Although I did 2 videos on insects a while back, so if you missed those and want to see them, I'll put a link to those below. But today, we're just talking nutrients. So you've probably seen this chart that I'm going to put on the screen here. This shows what the leaves can sometimes look like when there's a deficiency. Now you've probably seen these before, and you've probably heard people talk about how that they're not really accurate and you shouldn't use them. Now, are they 100% accurate? No, probably not. But if you're a home gardener and you don't have access to a lot of expensive testing equipment, I've found these things to be actually very helpful. A perfect example is just recently I had a bunch of tomato plants that were in containers. Normally I would have planted them in the garden already, but we had some late frosts, so they stayed in the containers a lot longer than they normally would. And one day I noticed that all of them, the bottom half, the leaves and stems were all starting to look yellow. The top half looked great. They were a nice, rich, dark green, and they were producing new leaves, but the bottom half were starting to yellow. Now this is a very classic sign of a nitrogen deficiency. So I added some nitrogen, and within a couple of days they started to green back up. Now what happens is when a plant is low on nitrogen, it starts to pull nitrogen from those bottom leaves and stems and move them to the top. The leaves and stems at the top are more important because they get more sunlight. That's where the flowering and fruiting is done. So the plant is willing to sacrifice those lower leaves. So you add some nitrogen and things perk back up. So the big question is, what do you use? Now, there are a lot of different options, but there are a few criteria that I really look for. First off is it needs to be water soluble. Granular fertilizers are nice, but they're meant to be slow release over time, weeks and even months. So when you have a deficiency, you want to treat that right away, which means something that needs to be water soluble. Now I like to stay away from the liquid fertilizers for this, because you want something that's going to be shelf stable, something that you can store for long periods and use it only when you need it. You also don't want something that's going to have a lot of different nutrients in it. You want to focus on just the nutrient that you really need at that time. And I like to stick with things that are natural, so I'm not going to be recommending any chemical fertilizers here today. And everything I'm going to talk about, I'm going to put the links down below. So what did I use? I used KNO3. Now you have some different options. You could use blood meal. Blood meal is a 1200, and it's a good option, but if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you might not be comfortable using blood meal in your garden. Also, blood meal can have a tendency to attract predators like coyotes and wolves and things like that, anything that you might have in your area. But KNO3, also known as potassium nitrate or saltpeter, is a powder. I think it does come in a granular too, but I definitely recommend the powder because it's more water soluble. You just put a tablespoon of it in a gallon of water, and then that'll be enough to do 4 or 5 plants. Now it doesn't come in this this glass container. It usually comes in a non-resealable bag, so I transfer it to something that's easier to open and close. And this really works well for me. Now KNO3 is a 13-0-45, so it has a lot of nitrogen, but it also has a lot of potassium. Normally I like to stick with just 1 or 2 nutrients, but fortunately potassium is one of those nutrients that there really is no toxicity level. So too much potassium isn't really going to be a problem. So you can add it even when you're focusing on the nitrogen. Now you don't want to go crazy with it because too much potassium can block a plant's ability to absorb other nutrients. But I've never really had a problem with it, so just keep an eye on the plant after you use it. And I'm really amazed. After using it, the bottom leaves started to green right up, and I noticed a lot of new growth all along the stem, and at the top I saw all sorts of new leaves and stems appearing. So I really like KNO3. I definitely recommend it anytime you think you might have a nitrogen deficiency. So the next thing is phosphorus. Now here too, there's a couple of things you can use. You can use bone meal, which is a 2-14-0, so it has a lot of phosphorus. But bone meal, again, it's an animal product, so if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you may not feel comfortable using it. It also has a tendency to attract rodents and squirrels and stuff to your garden, so that can be a downside as well. So I preferred seabird guano. So right here, you can see it says 0-11-0, and it's a powder, so it's water soluble, and there's instructions on the back, so it makes it pretty easy to use. And like most of this stuff, you can dissolve it in water, or you can just sprinkle it on the ground and water it in. Either way is just fine. Now, phosphorus appears on the plant usually in the form of purple spots or purple patches. So if you see that, you may want to add some phosphorus. So the next one is potassium. Now potassium often comes as yellow spots either on the leaf or around the edges, and yellow veins. That's the main one. Yellow veins on your leaves is a sign that you have a potassium or potash deficiency. And we have already talked about that. KNO3 has nitrogen and a lot of potassium, so it's the perfect thing to use when you think you might have a potassium deficiency. So the next one is magnesium. Now if you look on this chart, you'll notice that there are a few of the graphics where the leaves look kind of similar. And you may be a little unsure. Is it this thing? Is it magnesium? Is it something else? Whenever you think that it might be magnesium or something else, it's almost always going to be the something else. Magnesium is one of those things that the plant doesn't need a lot of and is very rarely going to be a magnesium deficiency. So if you're unsure, always go with the something else if you're unsure. But if you do think it's a magnesium deficiency, you should probably have a soil test done. Now there are lots of universities that will do soil tests, and it's about 20 bucks. I'm going to put a link down below to Rutgers. They'll do one. If you're absolutely sure it's a magnesium deficiency, then Epsom salts is definitely a very cheap and affordable way to go. You can get a pretty big bag of it for about $4, and it's 9% magnesium. So it's a very cheap, affordable, shelf-stable way to add magnesium. But I definitely don't recommend using it unless you're absolutely positive, because using magnesium and Epsom salts in the garden can cause other problems down the road. So use it sparingly and only if you're sure. So the next thing is calcium. Now calcium usually shows up as the very top and very new leaves being deformed. They often look like they're bubbling, or they're asymmetrical, so one side will look nice and the other side will be all weird looking. It's a very easy thing to notice, and in that case you need calcium, or I like to use garden gypsum. Now I like to buy it in a big 5-pound bag, and what I do is when I need it I just refill the smaller bag and keep the big bag in the garage. Now garden gypsum is 21% calcium, and it's mostly water soluble, meaning it's best to just put it on the ground, water it in. A lot of it will dissolve right away and the plants will be able to absorb it right away, but some of it will absorb slowly over time, and that's fine. And calcium also, or garden gypsum also has sulfur in it, but again, sulfur is one of those things that it's really hard to add too much of. So if you see those top leaves looking strange, calcium is the best way to go. So next we'll go to sulfur, and that is usually the yellowing of the leaves at the top. So it usually looks the exact opposite of a nitrogen deficiency, where those bottom leaves get yellow. Here it's yellowing leaves at the top. And it's really not terribly common. I've never had that problem myself, but if you do, again, garden gypsum has 17% sulfur and is a really good way to deal with that. And the best part is, because it also has calcium, calcium is one of those nutrients that also you can't really add too much of. Plants will only absorb as much calcium as they actually need. Unlike some nutrients, they can actually absorb too much of it. Calcium, that simply won't happen. So you don't have to worry about using too much of this. So the next one is iron. Now iron usually shows up as yellow leaves with green veins. And in that case, ironite. Now this is usually made and sold for people looking to put on their lawns. It's really great for making grass get green. I've used it a few times. You see a yellow spot in your lawn, sprinkle a little bit of this on it, and the lawn greens right up. But if you see those yellow leaves with green veins, it may be an iron deficiency, and you can just sprinkle some of this on and water it in. It works very well. It's a granular, so again, it has a long shelf life. Now, last but not least, is there are some micronutrients on that chart. Things like boron, copper, manganese, and molybdenum. Now, if you think you have an issue with any of those, the best thing is azomite. Now, you've probably heard me talk about azomite before. I always add a tablespoon of azomite to all my containers. It gets all those micronutrients that your potting mix doesn't have, but your garden soil usually does. And again, it's shelf stable. It's mostly water soluble, but it is a granular, so it'll release over time. I'll usually put another tablespoon in about halfway through the years in all my containers. So I like to have all of these things on hand, especially since some of them you're going to have to order. Now the garden gypsum and the ironite are usually pretty easy to find. You can get them at any home and garden store. But the KNO3, the seedbird guano, and the azomite you usually have to order. And if it takes a couple of weeks to show up, that could be a problem if you're trying to get a deficiency happening right away. Maybe if you have Amazon Prime or something and you can get it the next day, that'll be fine. But for the rest of us, I like to have this stuff on hand, and that way it stores and you can use it whenever you need it. So I think that's everything I wanted to talk about. If you got anything out of this, all I ask is that you hit the like button. And if you want to see the other videos that I'm going to be doing, you're going to have to subscribe. And I'll see you on the next one.